Alien girl swore never to trust a human until he carried her dying baby to safety. Her people called humans monsters, cold, selfish, and cruel. So when the bombs fell and the nursery collapsed, the alien mother shielded her baby with her own body, whispering prayers into smoke. Then a shadow moved through the fire, and a human, helmet cracked, bleeding, lifted her dying child with shaking hands and ran. The skies over Antheris 7th had once been sapphire clear, the kind of endless sky where alien children chased winged insects through the long grass, and mothers sat weaving hope into lullabies. But now it hung in permanent twilight, ash-choked, and bruised with the smoke of war. And in the shadow of those ruins lived a mother who had sworn never to trust a human again. Her name was Elira, and once she had been a respected envoy of the Lyrian race, gifted with a voice so serene it could calm riots and soothe dying soldiers. But none of that had mattered when the Terran Coalition's strike vessels cracked the sky like thunder and sent plasma lances screaming into her city, turning her diplomatic outpost into a cratered graveyard. Her mate had died that day, vaporized while trying to carry a truce flag across no man's land, and from that moment onward, her heart sealed itself behind the barbed wire of grief and vengeance, a vow etched deeper still when she learned the humans called the incident necessary collateral. Now in the bowels of a repurposed mining facility acting as a refugee shelter, she survived, not lived, barely breathing through days spent in ration lines and nights spent listening for sirens, all while shielding her only daughter, a frail infant named Kayla, from both the elements and the humans who ran the perimeter. Elira refused all contact with them, never met their eyes, never accepted aid unless forced, and taught Kayla in whispered tones that humans were dangerous, unpredictable, destroyers cloaked in false smiles. Still, Kayla was too young to understand hatred, and sometimes when Elira wasn't looking, her daughter would wave her tiny hand at the human patrols, particularly the tall one with soft eyes and a cracked helmet who always seemed to linger near their row of sleeping mats, pretending to check coolant gauges but sneaking glances at the alien child who giggled at him from behind her mother's legs. Elira noticed, of course, but she turned away, curling herself around Kayla at night and praying to the old gods that no human hand would ever come near her daughter. Not after everything, but fate, it seemed, did not care for vows or prayers, and it arrived not as a weapon, but as a fault in the planet's crust. A deep seismic groan that tore through the shelter without warning, rupturing fuel lines and toppling supports like paper straws, and in a heartbeat, the air filled with screams, alarms, and the hiss of escaping gas. Elira grabbed Kayla and ran for the exit, clutching her child so tightly the girl cried out, but halfway down the corridor, a pipe exploded. Overhead, and a section of the ceiling collapsed, hurling Elira backwards as flames surged through the passage. She hit the wall hard, her vision going black for seconds, and when she opened her eyes, Kayla was gone, trapped beneath the rubble that now blocked her path. Elira screamed, crawling through smoke and fire, her hands bleeding as she tore at metal beams, sobbing her daughter's name. But the only sound she could hear was the low, wheezing gasp of a child struggling to breathe. Her claws bent and snapped on the debris, and her lungs filled with smoke. And for the first time since the war, she felt true helplessness, not fury, not grief, but raw, crushing terror that she might lose the only thing she had left. "Please," she whispered, not sure who she was begging. "Please, anyone." And then, through the smoke, a shape appeared, tall and limping, helmet flickering red, one arm soaked in blood, and Elira's heart turned to ice as the human stepped into view. Him, the same one who always lingered too long, whose name she didn't even know, now standing there like a ghost conjured by her desperation. "Get away from her," she screamed, but her voice cracked and the human didn't stop, didn't flinch. He moved with urgency, not aggression, pulling aside the beams as though he didn't hear her curses or threats. His breathing labored as he reached the broken, barely moving body of Kayla and cradled her in his arms with a gentleness that made Elira's voice die in her throat. She tried to rise, but pain lanced through her spine, pinning her down, and she could only watch, paralyzed and furious, as the human glanced at her once, just once, with something like apology in his eyes, and then turned and ran, disappearing, into the fire with her baby in his arms. Elira screamed again, louder than before, her voice raw and filled with a fear she hadn't felt even when the warships came, because a human now held her child. and she had no idea whether he would save her or finish what his kind had started. The heat scorched his lungs with every breath, and the child's weight, though barely more than a bundle of feathers, felt heavier with each stride as Lucas forced his legs to keep moving through the burning wreckage of what had once been Shelter 9's South Corridor. Alarms blared in warbled distortion, drowned out by the deep roar of collapsing steel above him, and his cracked helmet flickered with HUD malfunctions that left blind patches in his peripheral vision. But still he ran, boots crunching over glass and twisted piping, his arms locked around the limp alien baby whose fragile chest rose in shallow, labored wheezes against his vest. He couldn't think about how close to death she was, couldn't afford to calculate how many seconds she had left. He just knew if he stopped now, if he faltered even for a moment, this tiny life would flicker out in his arms like a candle, suffocating in smoke, and he couldn't let that happen, not again. Not like last time. Kayla, he didn't even know her name yet, but it didn't matter, was already losing color, her silver-pink skin dulling beneath the soot and ash, and the faint luminescence of her race that normally glowed along the edges of her scalp now blinked erratically like a dying signal beacon, and Lucas whispered to her as he stumbled over a fractured bulkhead, "Hold on, little one. Just a bit longer." Though the words caught in his throat because the last time he'd said something like that it had been to his sister, 3 years ago, under a collapsing arcology on Mars, and she'd died before the medics arrived. He wouldn't let history repeat itself. Not if he could help it. Not even if the mother of this child had screamed at him to stay away. Not even if this baby's people saw him as a monster with a flag on his arm and war in his blood. Not even if it meant court-martial or exile or worse. Because the moment he saw that child buried in rubble, gasping for breath with a weak cry that somehow pierced through fire and noise, he'd moved without thinking, driven by something more primal than orders, more powerful than alliances. And now he was gambling everything on the hope that the outer medbay station had power and staff left after the quake. Fire bloomed along the eastern passage, swallowing one of the support struts in molten orange, and Lucas turned sharply down an auxiliary shaft, kicking open a grated panel that led into a utility tunnel barely high enough to crouch in. The heat chased him like a living thing, licking at his boots and igniting loose insulation behind him as he crawled forward, one hand clutching the child close to his chest, and the other dragging them through the narrow conduit. Kayla stirred slightly, coughing weakly, and the sound spurred him on like an electric jolt. He pushed harder, faster, ignoring the pain in his shoulder where a fragment of steel had pierced through his armor during the first shockwave, ignoring the blood dripping from his side, ignoring the way the edges of his vision dimmed every time his heart pounded too hard. Finally, the shaft ended in a maintenance alcove just a level below the medbay perimeter, and Lucas kicked it open, emerging into a corridor streaked with emergency lights and filled with the shrieks of evacuees and the distant bark of orders, shouted by overwhelmed officers. People screamed when they saw him. Some gasped at the sight of the alien child, and one soldier even raised a rifle before another shouted, "Stand down! He's got a kid! He's got a bloody baby!" And Lucas didn't stop to explain, didn't acknowledge the questions flung at him or the chaos swirling around them. He ran straight for the triage bay, where automated doors flickered open just long enough to admit him before they failed. And inside, the medic on duty, an older man with gray in his beard and oil stains on his gloves, blinked at him in disbelief before snapping to life as Lucas shouted, "She's not breathing right. Collapsed lung, maybe crush trauma, I don't..." "No, I need a regen field now," and the medic nodded, shouting for assistance as Lucas lay Kayla gently onto a med slab, his hands trembling as he stepped back, coated in ash and blood and the scent of smoke, watching as alien and human medics rushed around the tiny body, speaking in clipped voices, switching languages mid-sentence as they coordinated efforts to stabilize her. One of them turned to Lucas and pressed an oxygen patch to his chest, demanding he sit. But he shook his head, eyes locked on Kayla's motionless form, silently willing her to breathe, to live, to defy the odds stacked so mercilessly against her. Then, after what felt like a lifetime compressed into seconds, a sharp tone from the monitor indicated stabilization, and Kayla's chest rose more fully, her color returning slightly under the glow of the regen field. Relief hit Lucas, so hard his knees buckled and he dropped to the floor, adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion as pain surged through every fiber of his body. He sat there in silence, staring up at the ceiling, only half hearing the chaos around him, until a shadow fell over him and he looked up to see her, the child's mother, her face streaked with soot and tears, limping heavily, eyes burning with something more complex than rage, and when their gazes met, Lucas stood shakily, instinctively raising his hands in a gesture of peace, unsure whether she would strike him, curse him, or collapse from whatever hell she'd just fought her way through. She didn't speak at first, didn't rush to her daughter. She stared at Lucas as if trying to see past his bloodied exterior into whatever truth might lie beneath his actions, and then, slowly her eyes dropped to Kayla on the med slab, and something inside her cracked open. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees beside the table, touching her daughter's tiny hand with shaking fingers as the baby stirred faintly under the Regan lights, and Lucas saw the relief break her apart, saw the armor of hate fracture in real time, and though she didn't look back at him, her silence no longer burned with contempt but with confusion, uncertainty, a dawning awareness that the world she'd believed in might no longer be so black and white. A nurse came over to guide her to a bench, but she waved him away, choosing instead to sit on the floor beside the slab, one hand never leaving her daughter's. And Lucas turned to leave, unsure whether staying would help or hurt. But just as he reached the door, her voice called out, hoarse and rough but unmistakable. Why? And he stopped, not turning yet, because he didn't know how to answer a question that weighed so much. After a long pause, he said without looking back, because she cried the same way my sister did, and then walked out of the med bay, the silence behind him deeper than any thanks. 3 days passed, but to the alien princess, whose name was Soraya, once feared and praised as a diplomat warrior of the crystal moons of Verai, they blurred together like the last breaths of a long, fevered dream, and during that time she barely spoke to anyone. Not the nurses who tended to her burns, not the alien emissaries who came to retrieve her for safe escort off the station, and certainly not the human who had defied every rule of his own kind to save her daughter from fire and death. She spent every hour by Kayla's side, her long fingers gently tracing the soft hum of the Regan cradle, whispering to her in Varayan lullabies passed down for generations, songs of starlight and warmth, of safety found in shadow, of mothers who would burn galaxies to keep their children whole, and though Kayla had not yet regained full consciousness, her small fingers twitched at the sound of Soraya's voice, and that flicker of response was the only thread keeping Soraya from collapsing into despair. The pain in her ribs, the way her shoulder had been wrenched from a falling girder, even the hunger that gnawed at her from refusing the protein broth offered by the med team. None of it mattered compared to the fear that her daughter might wake into a world where her mother had not protected her well enough, where the fire had been faster than Soraya's limbs, where trust had to come not from a parent's arms but from a stranger's. And that stranger, that human soldier, Lucas, had not returned, though she had asked the nurses indirectly where he had gone, masking her question beneath a request for security logs or evacuation manifests, too proud to say his name, too proud to ask if he was safe. Yet every time the door to the med bay opened, her breath hitched before she turned, and every time it was not him, something cold settled deeper in her chest. The truth she did not want to face was that he had changed something fundamental in her, not by heroic gestures or words, but by bleeding beside her daughter, by running through fire without reason other than instinct, by refusing to explain himself as if saving a child were not extraordinary but expected. And it was this unfamiliar kind of honor that unsettled her more than any war, for it stripped away the comfort of hatred. Hatred she had worn like armor after what the humans had done to her world, to her brother, to the treaties they had torn like paper when greed outweighed peace. And now, because of him, that armor no longer fit, no longer shielded her from the truth that goodness had no species, and evil wore many uniforms, hers included. On the 4th day, Kyla opened her eyes, not fully, not brightly, but enough to send a wave of heat through Soraya's soul, enough to bring tears rushing up her throat so violently she choked on them, gasping for breath as she pressed her forehead to her daughter's, whispering her name again and again until the child blinked, confused but alive, and tried to speak. But Siraya hushed her gently, telling her she was safe, that the fire was over, that she was here, and that someone else had been here too, someone she might not remember but who had carried her through flame and darkness like a promise made flesh. Later that same night, when Kayla slept again and the medbay was quiet, Siraya stepped outside for the first time, her injuries wrapped, her posture still regal despite the limp, and wandered the temporary corridors of the relief zone, not sure where she was going until she found herself standing before a sealed bunk door with LTL Arden etched on a hand-scratched plate beside it. She stood there a long moment, debating whether to knock, whether this was weakness or closure. But before she could decide, the door hissed open from inside and Lucas stood there, shirtless, bandaged at the ribs, looking as surprised to see her as she was to be there. They stared at each other, and for once words felt too small, so she stepped inside without invitation and he stepped back without resistance, and the silence between them grew heavier with meaning. The room was Spartan, standard issue cot, ration packs on a crate, one faded photograph pinned to the wall of a woman holding a child, and she noted the absence of anything decorative, anything personal, save for the quiet in his eyes. "She's awake," Siraya said finally, her voice rough from disuse. And he nodded, not smiling but softening in the way his shoulders lowered. And then he said something that caught her off guard. "I'm glad. I've been waiting to hear that." And she realized then that he had stayed close all along. Not to be thanked, not to bask in redemption, but simply to be nearby in case the child's breath stopped again. And this humility, so alien to the command officers she had known, unraveled another thread of her certainty. She sat on the edge of a crate and looked at him, not as a soldier, but as a man, and said, "Why didn't you come?" And he answered without pretense, "Didn't think you'd want to see me." And she responded, "I didn't, but I couldn't stop wondering why you hadn't." And in that strange, delicate honesty, something passed between them, a recognition of shared wounds, shared burdens neither had chosen but both had carried. They talked for hours in fragments and pauses, about nothing and everything, about how he'd lost his sister, about how Siraya had once believed peace with humans was possible, until her brother died in a border skirmish no human nation would claim responsibility for, about how both of them were tired of being tools for governments that forgot the faces of children when they planned their wars. By dawn, she stood to leave but paused at the door, turning back to look at him and asked, "Will you come see her?" And when he hesitated, she added, "She should know the truth, even if she can't remember it." And he nodded slowly, as if accepting, not just an invitation but a burden, one he was willing to carry. And so, that morning, as Kyla blinked into the dim light of the recovery room, Lucas stepped inside quietly, unsure what to say. But Kyla, though still weak, reached out with a hand barely strong enough to lift, and Siraya caught her breath as the little girl pointed to him and murmured something soft in Varayan, a word that meant firewalker, a name from stories her people told about beings who crossed through flame to carry lost souls to safety. And though Lucas didn't understand the language, he felt the weight of it settle on his chest like an old truth rediscovered. And when Siraya translated, she did so with a voice that trembled not with fear, but with awe. And in that moment something shifted, not just between them, but in the room itself, as if history had tilted slightly on its axis, bending away from war and toward something fragile, uncertain, and deeply human. The official evacuation orders came 3 days later, delivered with the cold efficiency of wartime logistics. Her people had arrived with a sleek interstellar skiff, diplomatic insignia pulsing like a heartbeat down its hull. And though Siraya had known this moment was coming, had anticipated it with the same dread as one awaits a verdict that will separate the present from everything after, she found herself unable to prepare for the way her daughter reached instinctively for Lucas when the human bent to say goodbye. Her tiny fingers curling around the fabric of his jacket, with the quiet desperation of someone who had not only been saved by him, but, in the fragile hours that followed, had come to associate his voice, his scent, his presence with life itself. And for a long moment, Soraya simply stood there on the platform, watching her daughter refuse to let go, watching Lucas freeze in that awkward way of someone who does not believe he has earned affection. And she realized with sudden clarity that trust, real trust, had already passed between them when she hadn't been looking. That this man who once stood as a symbol of everything she'd taught her daughter to fear had become something else entirely. Not an exception to the rule, but the beginning of a new one. The alien guards were growing uneasy, shifting on their heels, fingers too close to weapons they did not need, and Soraya raised a single hand to calm them, then crossed the deck to her daughter and crouched low, her joints still aching, but her voice calm as she said, "It's time, my starling." But Kayla only shook her head, eyes wide and filled with tears, whispering a word in their native tongue that meant stay. And Lucas, ever uncertain, said quickly, "It's okay, she's scared, it's normal, she'll forget me in a week." But Soraya knew that wasn't true. Not with her kind. Not when memory and emotion encoded in neural waves the way humans recorded video. And she looked at him then, not with suspicion, not even with gratitude, but with something rarer. Consideration, the quiet weighing of possibility. And she said, "Walk with us to the shuttle." And he blinked in surprise, but nodded, scooping the child into his arms with the gentle care of someone who had once carried grief and now carried something else entirely. The walk was slow, the hangar doors rising like the end of a story written in fire and ash, and as they reached the ramp of the skiff, Kayla clutched at his collar one last time, then pressed her brow to his in the traditional gesture of parting. For her people, and Lucas, awkward but sincere, returned it without quite understanding, and stepped back as Soraya lifted her daughter into her arms. The door began to seal, but before it did, she turned back to him and asked, "Would you have still carried her if you'd known who she was?" And Lucas, eyes steady, simply said, "She was a child." And Soraya nodded. No more words left, because what else could be said after that? The shuttle rose, engines humming like a held breath, and disappeared into the stars with the solemn grace of something both ending and beginning. And Lucas stood alone on the deck for a long time afterward, unsure of what had just changed, only that something had. Weeks passed and the station was rebuilt in segments. Civilians returned. New alliances were whispered about in corridors between diplomats who were suddenly willing to entertain negotiations they had long refused. And one day, out of nowhere, Lucas received a communication packet marked with diplomatic encryption and flagged urgent. Not from his own chain of command, but from Virai itself. He opened it in the privacy of his quarters, expecting perhaps a formal commendation, a sterile thank you from a culture famous for its ceremonial rigidity. But what he found instead were two things. The first, a live visual stream that flickered open to show Kayla, laughing, truly laughing, silver eyes bright, her hair grown back in soft tufts, her hands busy building some kind of glittering model city from crystal shards. And as she spotted the camera, she pointed and said, something that the translation system rendered as, "Tell Firewalker I remember." The second item was a formal invitation, an official request to attend a cultural exchange summit as a non-military civilian liaison, specifically requested by Soraya herself, who had signed the letter in both her formal Virian title and beneath it, simply, "From one protector to another." Lucas sat back, stunned, the weight of it crashing over him like a second shockwave. Not the honor, but the trust it implied, the deliberate dismantling of a barrier that had once seemed as immovable as history itself. And somewhere between the lines of protocol and proposal, he realized something else. He had not just carried a dying child to safety, he had carried hope through the fire, and it had survived. The summit was held on a neutral moon orbiting the twin stars of the Virian system, and when he arrived, clumsy in the ceremonial garb hastily stitched for him by station tailors, Soraya greeted him not on a stage, not in a hall of glass, and banners, but on the quiet garden path leading from the landing zone, Kayla running ahead of her with arms outstretched, calling his name in 3 languages. And as Lucas knelt to catch her in an embrace that felt like home, Soraya watched with eyes that no longer burned with suspicion, but held something gentler, fiercer. A trust that had been earned, not given, and a bond that had been forged not by treaties or politics, but by a single act of impossible kindness when it mattered most. Together, they walked toward the summit, not as soldier and alien, not as enemies or even emissaries, but as three lives tangled by fire and choice, and a future no longer dictated by the past. And somewhere high above them, where the sky split into twin suns and drifting light, the stars bore witness, silent and bright, to a story that could no longer be unwritten.